Not. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are not live with Coffee with Jen and Sharon. We are Inside Scoop with Sue. So welcome. Yes, here we are. Welcome to Inside Scoop with Sue. And today I am here with Erica Komisar, who is a clinical social worker, a psychoanalyst, and the author of Chicken Little, The Sky Isn't Falling, Raising Resilient Adolescents in the New Age of Anxiety. So couldn't be more timely. We also are lucky to have 5 books to give away. So if you want to put your name in, email editor@yourteenmag.com. And that will be in the comments at some point. Hopefully Jessica's here and she'll put that into the comments. So again, if you want to put your name in for one of the books, email editor@yourteenmag.com. So welcome, Erica.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so our topic today is, I think, something that everyone deals with. I know I dealt with it 5 times. I have 5 kids. Each one had their own set of hot buttons, and hot buttons for me. How do we get along better with our teens? We often feel like we're at odds over so many things. And do we have to just accept that it's inevitable?
Well, I mean, conflict with your teens is inevitable because, as I say, conflict brings intimacy. So there's a certain amount of conflict with adolescents. And I just want to broaden the idea of teens because adolescence begins so much earlier. It begins at 9 and it ends at 25. So, when I talk about teens, we think of like 13 to 19, but actually adolescence is a lot bigger now and a lot longer. But to say that there's no way to avoid conflict because conflict is a vehicle, it's a tool for them to separate from us. So there's 2 big developmental milestones that they have to, tasks of adolescence to get through and get to adulthood. 1 is to physically separate from us. And 2 is to individuate, or what that means is to create their own identity separate from us, to learn to live separate from us, but to learn who they are as human beings separate from us, and to be able to live in that identity. And so those 2 really big tasks mean that there's going to be conflict. So it's not avoiding conflict entirely, it's reducing it, and it's also learning how to manage it and cope with it in such a way that you don't, that the conflicts are handled well, that you don't exacerbate them and they don't turn into bigger things. And also that they create a space where you can be close to your adolescents after you get through the conflict rather than distancing them.
I'm so comforted by that because we were overachievers in the conflict department in our house. And it always seemed like we were on an island. So it's comforting to hear that that's like part of the process. Can you kind of distill, like, what are the top things that come up between parents and teens that create the most conflict?
Well, I mean, I think one of the big things is parents wanting their teens or their adolescents to be like them. And, we all really have a fantasy of our kids being like us. And I think it would be false to say that every parent doesn't have that fantasy. And so learning to live with the reality that they may not be like you. They may not be like you constitutionally. They may not be like you in terms of your likes and dislikes, your beliefs, your tastes in music, your tastes in art, your tastes in friends, your taste, in clothing. And so that's probably causes the most conflicts, is really me, not me, that me, not me conflict for parents. And so, your kids are going to be different in many ways. If you handle it well, the conflict, then they may come back and be like you in more ways than you think. If you don't handle it well and you become defensive, judgmental, controlling. I could go on and on, but you get the drift.
Yeah, but what if we don't know that that's what's happening? Like, I can say that I didn't know that being shy was what my daughter was, and it wasn't like I was supposed to teach her. Like, oh, honey, why don't you go over there and hang with all your friends, right? Like, I didn't know that it wasn't my role. So how do we know that? I don't think our motives are always like, I want them to be like me. It's that we think we
I
play a
think it's
role in it.
I think it's mostly unconscious. I write books because I'm a psychoanalyst. I believe that your unconscious defines your behavior more than your conscious state of mind, particularly if you're unaware of it. So my books are to make people aware of their unconscious so they can behave differently with their kids, right? And so they can react and not react to things that happen. And I think one of the things is parents need to be very self-aware if they're going to regulate conflict with their kids. They need to be really self-aware. And that means we do need to be as aware as possible of our desire to control the outcome for our children. There are only a couple of things that are constitutional to our kids. Interesting that you brought up shyness. Most of what happens to our kids is environmental. That nature nurture whole paradigm, I would say about 90% of who our kids become is environmental. And we're a big part of their environment. But they have other parts of their environment when they're adolescents. They have their friends, their peers, their school, their other communities, maybe their religious communities. But only about 10%, I would say, is constitutional. And what I mean by that is our children are born either more aggressive or less aggressive, meaning more passive. And you can see this in the first day they're born. You can see this. You can go into a nursery in a hospital and see the difference between a baby who is more sensitive to stress, a baby who is less sensitive to stress. A baby is more aggressive and demanding to get their needs met, a baby who's more shy and reserved and reticent to get their needs met. And that's pretty much it. But that's a big deal. So, because the research shows that when you have a constitutionally sensitive baby, if you treat them sensitively, and my books talk about sensitive empathic nurturing in the beginning, from 0 to 3 was the first book I wrote. The book that's coming out now is How You Can Be a Sensitive and Empathic Parent. And when you're sensitive and empathic with an adolescent, it reduces the acting out, reduces the conflict, but it also reduces the expression of that sensitivity in your child, meaning sensitivity to stress. If you get in,
That's kind of it's a little counterintuitive, right?
it is
Like
counterintuitive.
give them what they need. Don't push them out of their comfort zone.
That's right. And if you do that, then epigenetics is the science. It's a pretty new science of how our genes and how our environment come together to create problems for us. Meaning, just because we have a sensitive gene or sensitivity to stress, or, and you're saying shyness, that may be her personality, but she may also be sensitive to a little bit of stress, and socializing may cause her a little bit of stress. And when we're sensitive with our kids in response to their sensitivity, it neutralizes the expression of things like anxiety and depression. And so shyness may not then become social anxiety if we handle it well. So isn't that interesting? Shyness is a personality part, which is constitutional. But shyness can then become social anxiety. And we have the power as parents to help that shyness not become social anxiety.
So give us like your best tip for how someone who's listening right now is like, I want to do better. I don't know how to handle this situation. I have a kid who is X, fill the blank. What's the best way we can be that sensitive parent?
Well, one thing is know your child. I mean, you know your child more than anyone else. So the idea of emotional attunement, knowing who your child is emotionally, knowledge of your child, but also knowledge of their environment. So knowledge is power, right? We always say knowledge is power. The more you know about your child's life, their social situation, their school environment, the more you can be empathic. Right? Presence, physical and emotional presence as much as possible. What I say is 0 to 3, 9 to 25, more is more. The more physically and emotionally present you can be, I mean, we can't be there every moment, but the more you're there, the more you'll be there when, in my book, I say when the door opens. And when I say when the door opens, I mean it both as a metaphor and as a real thing, because teenagers close their doors. It's a way of being private and having privacy, but also it's a defense, right? They close their doors to push you out. Remember, I said separation is really important, but they still need you desperately, and that's the thing that most parents of teenagers don't know, they need you desperately. So when the door opens, literally and figuratively, when their defenses come down and the door to their room opens and you're there, guess what? They're more likely to communicate with you openly about their feelings, their experiences. And if you ask really good open-ended questions, you avoid judgment of any kind. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. So we listen more than we talk. And you don't give them advice unless they ask for it. You listen, become a really good listener, ask open-ended questions and listen, and ask them if they would like your advice. And if they say, no, not really, don't give it.
So
It's very
it's so hard to do, but I know it's doable. I've heard people report back that they're doing it and that it's working so well. I try also, but it's much harder than, so everyone use your ears more than your mouth.
yeah.
Okay. So I want to give you a scenario that I think, I don't know why these things embarrass our kids so much, but I was noticing in an amusement park this summer that almost every dynamic around me was a teenager rolling their eyes because the mother was either singing or dancing, maybe just breathing, but talking to strangers. Like, why are those things that embarrass our teenagers so much? And what's our response supposed to be to that? Do we stop singing? Do we stop breathing?
So here's the thing. I know parents take it so personally, right? Is that teenagers have a part of their brain that is, it's called asymmetrical brain development is what's going on in teenagers. And what that means is the part of the brain that's the threat sensing part of the brain, the amygdala, is hyper vigilant, very active. And that means that they always feel a sense of threat. And what that does is it makes them incredibly sensitive to criticism, particularly harsh criticism, and it makes them very self-conscious. So you know that feeling when you're a teenager, you look in the mirror and you see a pimple on your nose and you think everybody's going to be looking at that pimple. You are that pimple. They really feel that because the threat sensing part of them is on high alert. The problem is the emotional regulation part of the brain, or the prefrontal cortex, is lagging behind in development. And it doesn't really regulate that threat sensing part fully till about 25. So they're very hyper vigilant with themselves. They're very self-conscious with themselves. Everything they do, they say, their hair, it's why they spend an hour in the bathroom when you spend 10 minutes in the bathroom. They're very fearful that people will judge them. And so some of that fear gets projected onto you. All of your imperfections become scary to them. And, you know, they also are de-idealizing you. That's another thing that's happening. And they have to de-idealize you to leave. It's part of the separation process. If you're perfect, then they can't leave. If you're perfect, then they have to be perfect. So they have to, as a process, and I always say this is where knowledge comes in. If you know as a parent that your teenager has to de-idealize you to accept the imperfections in themselves, they have to see your imperfections and point them out to accept their imperfections, then you don't get so sensitive. Then you don't take it personally. Then you don't feel persecuted by it. And that's half the battle. Because as parents, if we feel calm and secure and not under attack, then we can help our kids. So when my son or my daughter say to me, you know, you look really old, I say, yeah, you know, it's true. I am getting old. It's true, right? I see all my wrinkles and, you know, it's okay. That's what you need to do with it. But if instead you go, what do you mean? That's such a mean thing to say. And I'm not old and I'm young, right? So we can adjust how they accept their own imperfections by showing them how gracefully we accept our imperfections.
Okay, that's really beautiful. And I also love, like, it's for me, it's so hard to just think about how I have to get armor to be like stronger around them. But if I see their vulnerability, as you just explained, it's much easier to be empathic because I understand a little of what's going on. Like, they're actually terrified that they'll be judged by you.
And by their peers. I mean, they're constantly. So whenever someone is critical of another, they're 100 times more critical of themselves. So I think it was the Dalai Lama who said, and I'm going to absolutely sort of bastardize this quote, but when those who make others suffer are suffering themselves.
Yeah, that's the bully bullied, right? We know that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was beautiful. Thank you. And I also just want to remind our audience that if you have any questions for Erica, please put them in the chat. So this is going to be family decisions, right? Like we have a decision in our family that you don't go to a party where alcohol will be served in high school. And you say no to your kid. You know you have to say no because it's aligned with your family values. But you also have a pit in your stomach because you know what's about to follow. And it's going to be all the other parents said yes. And it's going to be, I hate you, all of these things. So is there a way to make that conversation go less terribly than it typically does?
Yes. But I think, so I want to address it in a slightly different angle if I can. I think that the truth is they're going to be exposed to things like alcohol and drugs. And I think if you come down too intensely against them interacting with their peers around those things, it may be the slightly wrong angle. And I'll explain why. That if we, it's like eating. If you're restrictive with sugar with your kids, they're going to go out and binge on sugar. If you're restrictive with an environment where there's things like alcohol and drugs, they are going to feel in some way rebellious at some point and find it more interesting. So I think maybe the better approach is to help them to understand, give them knowledge, and help them with what I call the bridge between their actions and their consequences, meaning educate them in a non-judgmental, non-anxious way about the consequences of drinking too much, knowing that they will be exposed to things like alcohol and drugs, but that there are consequences to these things, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to actually give them coping mechanisms. That's how you build resilience. So you're trying to give them a way for their own egos to function, to help their egos, their judgment to function better. So we know that judgment, executive functioning, which is tying actions to consequences, this part of the brain is part of the right brain. And again, the right brain isn't fully developed. Remember that emotional regulation part that I talked about isn't fully developed till 25. So that means that they don't necessarily make the connection between actions and consequences. So we can educate them. For instance, say, look, if you're going to go to that party, you need to know something, that kids are going to drink, they're going to do shots. They're going to do a lot of alcohol. They're going to drink 12 shots, 15 shots of vodka. And I'm going to teach you something about alcohol. That hard alcohol doesn't kick in right away. And if you if you try it, because I know at some point you're going to try it, you need to understand that if you don't wait for the effect of one shot, it may be enough. Because if you don't wait and you keep doing it thinking, oh my God, I'm not feeling anything, I better keep drinking, you can actually get something called alcohol poisoning and die from alcohol poisoning. And a lot of kids do, because they inadvertently keep drinking shots because they haven't yet felt the effects of the alcohol. So things like that are better guards for your children.
I love that answer. I think it arms us with really a good way to approach that scenario. Yeah. Is there a scenario that you can think of where no might be the appropriate answer, not the one I gave, but just generally, and then we know we're in for at least an angry, bitter child because they were looking for yes.
Yes. So one example would be hard no is anything to do with health and safety. You don't get into a car where someone else has been drinking, or you don't drive a car if you've been drinking. And again, the idea is this is a hard no, and this is why. So the old school of parenting 50, 75 years ago is, and I don't know where this came from. I think there must have been some parenting books that were really idiotic. And I'm not going to name them, but I'll just say they were pretty idiotic, saying, as a parent, you have authority and you don't need to explain anything to your children. You just need to say no. And I think there's some idiotic books out there now that say that. And I'm going to say that that really is the wrong approach, because your kids they can't make the connection. The thread is missing. The bridge is missing until about 25 between, if I do this, this will happen. And the other thing is, there's another part of the brain called the ventral striatum. It is the reward center of the brain. It is also very hyperactive, not yet regulated by the emotional regulation part. These two parts of the brain are very, very busy. And yet the emotional regulation part is not regulating this part. So that means that kids are very sensitive to exciting new things, novelty, excitement, impulsivity, any kind of rewards. If they experience stimulation, the brain of an adult reacts very different to a lot of stimulation than the brain of a teenager. The brain of a teenager, when there's a lot of stimulation, they have 10 times the dopamine response. And so that's why there's things like addiction is more of a big thing with teens. But if we know that, then we can help explain to our adolescents the reason you don't drive or you don't get in a car with someone who is drinking is because their judgment is impaired. And once you get into a car accident, your life can be ruined. You can die, and your life will be changed and ruined forever. You can be crippled, And so what you're doing is you're actually elevating an anxiety for risk, because they don't understand the risk reward connection. They just feel the reward. They don't see it.
Okay.
The risk is exciting.
I'm going to take it away. I'm going to take it away from the health and safety. Yeah. So I think that was great. I think you gave us really solid advice. Let's say it's a holiday and you're going to a relative's house, maybe grandma and grandpa, and your teenager says, "I'm not going."
Okay. There's the bridge again. What another part of the right brain that's not fully developed? Empathy. Again, maybe I should just define what the right brain is responsible for. It's responsible for executive functioning, kind of connecting the action to consequences. It's responsible for empathy. It's responsible for resilience to stress. It's responsible for, as I said, regulation of impulsivity. And the biggest part is it's responsible for regulation of emotion, keeping your emotions from going too high and too low. That's why you have a lot of anxiety and depression in adolescence. But it's responsible for empathy. The ability to feel for others is not something that is fully developed in them till about 25. And we project onto them what I call adultomorphizing. We project onto them adult-like feelings. And instead of judging them, to understand that, and then you have to help them with the bridge and say, gosh, if you don't go to grandma's, I wonder how grandma's going to feel. You do what I call I wonder. It's called mentalizing. I wonder how grandma's going to feel. How do you think grandma's going to feel? Instead of telling them, well, if you don't go, your grandma's going to be so upset. And then you've just done it all for them. Instead, you're trying to get the cables from your car and jumpstart that part of their brain, start to get it to be more active. And I think once you get their empathy going, then they go, right, grandma's going to be really upset. And you go, yeah, gosh, I think she'd be really sad. And grandma's getting older, right? Like, how will it be? How would you feel if grandma isn't around for much longer and you miss some holidays with grandma? Yeah, that would be. You're trying to get that part of the brain to work, but in a non-judgmental way. And that's a very different way of parenting than the old idiotic books that say, just say you're going to Christmas at grandma, that kind of thing.
I mean, it feels softer and gentler to me, and it feels relationship building, but it's also counter to what culturally I grew up with. Mm-hmm. And then I have to fight the urge and actually believe that this is the better way. Like, I have to buy into what you're just telling me now. Yeah. And you give a good case for it. I'm all in.
Yeah. And I will say that there is some benefit. You're not going to like to hear this, but I say things to a lot of people that they don't like to hear, that if they still say no after you've done that empathy building, you leave them with the guilt that they didn't go to grandma's, and there's some benefit to that. So I don't think guilt is a bad thing. I think it's sometimes a very good thing. And so by bringing them along to grandma's, you prevent them from feeling guilty. But sometimes guilt is a useful tool, right? And as a tool, it the next Christmas or the next Hanukkah or the next whatever Thanksgiving, if they didn't go, they felt badly. And you can tap into that and say, I wonder how you felt. Was it lonely being alone on a holiday? Did you feel, and so what you're doing is you're trying to get them to start, that part of them to start to be active. And if you just say, come down, listen, there are some things, the bottom line is there's some things that kids have to do, right? They have to go to the doctor. They have to get their vaccines for school. They have to go to school a certain number of days of the year. There's some things that they really have to do. And then the rest, we're trying to get them not to want to do, but to understand the importance of those things. And I think the best way to go about that is to have empathy for them if you want them to have empathy for others. And so one thing you can do with that Hanukkah or that Thanksgiving is to say, it must be really hard for you. So you do reflection and mentalizing, which is you reflect their feelings. If you ask me one critical thing that parents can do to be closer to their teenagers, it is to be empathic. And that means to identify their feelings and put them into words. In social work school, we used to say, put a person's feelings into words, articulate them, either their body language or what they're saying. And when a kid says, I don't want to go to Thanksgiving to grandma's, you have to then go into mentalizing mode, which is using your imagination to figure out why they might not want to come and putting it into words. I wonder if you don't want to go to grandma's because you get bored there, or because grandma's old and it's scary to be around old people. Old people smell, they feel differently. It reminds you that mommy and daddy can die, that, it's going into imagination mode to put into words what you think their experience is. That in and of itself may help them to come along with you because they feel understood.
The other part of it is that what we perceive as winning might not be winning.
Right.
Like getting them to come with us might not be the win. Getting them to understand that they felt badly after saying no might actually be the win.
Yeah, because if you want to be close to them, then you need to be close to them by understanding them and not by bossing them around. A lot of parents think their role is to boss their kids around. And what you end up doing is you end up distancing your kids. If you're just a bossy parent and a disciplinarian, you actually end up distancing your kids. And sometimes that rift is so bad, you never get that closeness back. That's the reality.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Erica Komisar, this is a softer, gentler relationship with our kids, and people are here because they want to strive for that. So thank you for giving us some of the tools. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.